Hi, welcome to Quid Pros Quo. I'm Rin,
And I'm Zach.
and today we are joined by a very special guest, Christian, who is a game writer. Christian, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. So I am a jack of many trades. I dabble in music. I also dabble in carpentry, leather crafting, a little bit of vesting, programming, and also game development. I like to call myself a jack of all, master of one, which is learning.
Nice.
That is so much better than the jack of all trades, master of none. I love that. That's so good.
Yeah, that's like such a good paradigm to have. I love that so much. So, how did you see how long you've been game writing for?
Oh, no, you're good. I've been game writing for probably my entire life, literally. Like, I'm not actually joking. I've been designing games since I was about 5. For being more accurate. I remember my first game I started designing, I was playing I Declare War, the card game, and I thought, at 9 years old, I think I could make a better game than this. So I designed a game called Pillars that was based off the idea that you could allow you to basically do multiple hands of I Declare War all at once in 5 minutes.
Wow. That's pretty cool. I'm excited. I'm so excited for this episode. This is gonna be so fun because I think game writing is cool, but I don't even know how to develop the skill set for it because I'm not game writing minded like you seem to have been since a young age.
Yeah.
Could you walk us through a little bit more about how you went from, because you're publishing a TTRPG. Like, I've seen your posts, beautiful. They're so interesting. Walk us through how you got from developing that game at 9 to developing and pitching a TTRPG.
So basically, when I started realizing I wanted to do something with this kind of weird skill that I had growing up, I initially thought I wanted to be a writer. I realized very quickly that I'm actually not super great at writing, like the traditional writing. But I remember talking with my sister, who is a very good writer, and she's just like, it sounds more like you're like a storyteller. And I was like, there's a difference. And turns out there is. And when I started kind of going through the process of telling stories, I wanted to combine my love of also designing games with it. And I remember when I was about 19, I started playing D&D, and I really liked D&D. And I remember as I was kind of going through and kind of looking at all the rules, I was like, man, similar to the 9-year-old me, I could probably do something really similar to this. And before that, like a couple of years, I was working on a Lego board game that was a tabletop role-playing game. And I remember arguing with my friends and just going back and forth over rules for hours and hours and hours. I was working on that one for about 7 years as well. So I kind of went from designing card games as a kid and optimizing other games and making up games with my friends to working on like a modified version of chess to working on like a Lego modular TTRPG. And then when I finally realized D&D was like a type of game you could make, I'm like, I want to do that. And, call me crazy for trying to improve upon the quote unquote greatest game of the world, but somebody has to try it.
Which is so true. Like, I am a huge fan of D&D and other TTRPGs. Zach is too. We've done episodes on it before. So when you're building a TTRPG, this is a more collaborative process. And I know you said you're more of a storyteller than a writer, but how does the collaborative writing process differ from a solo writing process?
So a lot of times when I'm going through the process of designing mechanics and thinking about how they fit into whatever themes I got going on, you would normally think of when you're writing a regular game, like writing a scene, you would just kind of think of it from point A to point B. But when you're designing a game, you have to think about every single possible scenario that system or mechanic you could be found in. So it's a lot more mapping out different gameplay loops and different use cases or even failure cases. And it's really, really technical. Not saying that writing isn't, it's just it's very adjacent. It's maybe 2 or 3 degrees off. Versus while I think a book is more linear, you're really having to kind of do these weird gymnastics with designing your systems and mechanics. And a lot of the cases, your mechanics have to work too. They have to actually make practical sense. Versus in a book, you can kind of get away with kind of having some loose things and like, oh, this one very emotional moment, the person overpowers the particular like mechanics of the world just to have a plot twist. You can't really do that in the game as much because if the game rules stop working, then the game doesn't work and it's not as fun. So it's definitely really similar, but also kind of divergent in that way.
Yeah, because when you're building a game, you're basically building a framework where other people are going to use it to build their own stories, where they're going to get around a table, they're going to sit for, 2 to 4 hours, and when they get to the end of it, they're going to have a story that they can go and tell when they're sitting at the water cooler. That definitely exists in modern day workplaces where people chat. Could you talk about how you think about gameplay mechanics that prime the pump for this kind of collaborative storytelling that happens inside of TTRPGs?
Yeah, I think having some techniques as far as pulling the players into the world is really important. So when like I have a table of players around me and I want to kind of help them immerse themselves more, I usually set up the scene, I ask them a few questions, and then I wait a few minutes. And a lot of times what happens is I get silence. So in that case, I usually always have a companion supporting character or some type of event that happens to kind of get the players moving or to kind of give them some hints to keep everything moving. In addition to that, if a player says they want to do something, I usually try to always say yes and, or I say, yeah, you can do that, but here's a
Right.
few consequences. I call this a hard bargain. It's actually an actual mechanic in Salt that basically says you could do something, but there's a cost to what you're doing. And then my favorite little mechanic that I've kind of use a lot is that sounds really rad. Let's do it. Like literally, let's just do it because what you just
Well, of cool.
yeah, it's effectively the same thing. Because I feel like the more you allow your players to engage in the world and you don't slap their wrist whenever they leave the sphere of the rules, the more you really get the storytelling juices flowing because you're working together when you're telling a story, not just I'm the one narrating and you're just listening. If you wanted to do that, you could either watch a movie, listen to a audio book, or listen to a podcast.
All right. What sort of we've talked about how this concept of yes and no but, yes but, those sorts of techniques, which when you're doing role-playing games, that's very similar to how improvisational theater works. What other sorts of techniques and motifs belong to game writing versus other kinds of writing?
So when you're designing a game, there's a lot of things you have to consider as far as how the game's going to flow. So when you read a book, it has a start and end, and it's, again, pretty linear as far as how it goes. I mean, there's definitely overarching storylines and plots and character development, but like it's set in stone in the sense that it goes from front to back, and that's pretty much it. With a game, you have gameplay loops. So you have systems of techniques and mechanics that all kind of interconnect and loop back in on themselves in dynamic and expanding ways. They are living systems of gameplay that you have to respect and be aware of when you're designing. I think of like deck building games like Magic the Gathering. That's Turing complete. You can literally simulate anything in that system. So that is the kind of writing that you have to consider when you're creating a game versus writing a book. You don't have to worry about somebody creating an infinite loop glitch where they're able to get infinite mana when you're writing a book. You just write it so that that doesn't happen. Not only that, but the less you do when you're writing, the better. A lot of people get kind of enamored with these really flashy, cool rules. But at the end of the day, you really just want a simple mechanic that works and that people can use practically. And I find a lot of game traps that you can find yourself in when writing is going for the shiny object rather than the trusty wrench or hammer that you might find on the side. Like there's definitely tried and true mechanics like, resources, cooldowns, tokens, dice, cards, and like skill trees that people try to be fancy with when you could just use what works. I mean, modern games are built a certain way because they work, not because that's just the way that everybody does it.
It reminds me of an adage from, this is going way back, guys, but I don't know if any of you watch Good Eats with Alton Brown, but he talked about how you don't want unitaskers inside of your kitchen. Like, you want the tools that can do lots of different things rather than the one gizmo that only does the one thing. And with games, it sounds very similar, where you want something that is flexible rather than, okay, for the grappling rules, right? There's the joke that anytime that you want to do grappling, it's like the hardest part of any system because it's all like, you got to do the contested roll and you got to add this and subtract that and compare and da-da-da-da-da, which is not super fun for most people.
Yeah, and actually, to that point, I wanted to mention something when I was developing my games, is that I realized at one point, this is actually a really fundamental key for game design, especially, is if you have a couple of concepts and you think of a new one that is able to completely encompass all those other concepts and still function by itself, go with that concept. Even if it means undoing years of work, which I've done that concept that can basically summarize and contain all those other concepts will always be better than any of those individual cool concepts on their own.
Mm-hmm.
That makes a lot of sense. So we've talked a lot about how like game writing works. What happens when game writing like doesn't work? Like what's the equivalent of writer's block or resistance in game writing?
I will answer that question with a series of stories, actually.
Go for it.
So I've been designing this game for 7 years, and over that 7 years, I've wanted to take the 30 pages worth of rulebook stuff that I had at the time and throw it out the window way more than 7 times. I remember when I was about 25, so about 3 years ago, I had a friend. He is a power gamer. Like, he is a wonderful tester, but he drove me insane because I would design these systems that were really flashy and really cool, and he would take them and turn them into pretzels and basically turn the entire game system inside of itself and cause all sorts of mayhem while still being within the rules. And in those moments, I often found myself being extremely discouraged because I would spend months designing these beautiful gameplay loops and thinking about the most optimal way that a person could use it, when I would fail to realize that most people are just going to look at that and be like, but what if I do that? And I'm like, why would you want to do that? It's like, well, because I can. And I realized early on with my game design process is that people don't actually want like infinite freedom, because that's what I was trying to go for originally. They want choices, because choices are much more contained and well constructed. If you give them too many choices, they end up breaking the system. So when somebody breaks the system, I took a break, honestly, when my friend broke the system. I took 8 months off from writing. So this is effectively the writer's block equivalent of game design. I was not really happy with the way the system was working. The gameplay loops were kind of just all over the place. I had all these disparate systems that just weren't working together, and I needed to take a couple steps back. And it's really not much different than writing a book in this case. It has the same root cause. You feel frustrated and you feel like you're not really making any progress. So a lot of the solutions to that is to take a break. Another great solution is to talk to somebody else about it and get some fresh eyes on it. And what I really find is inspirational is actually talking to friends and saying, like, if you're in my position, how would you handle this, or what would you do with this system? And, I feel like I get a lot of inspiration from working with other people and a lot of unique ideas that what I wouldn't have thought of on my own. So I feel like that's a really good way to kind of move beyond that. And I think that's also true for writing, getting some perspective on what you're doing and really where you're going with your book, or in this case, your game.
I love that. Just the idea of inviting, people who you're close to and people who you trust to put themselves inside of your position and kind of work through it so that you can get a new perspective on like how you're thinking about it, because I feel like a lot of times when somebody else talks through something and how they're thinking about it, I realize that I have some kind of mental hang up, or there's some kind of block that I didn't realize was there, or I'm thinking about this in like one particular way and I couldn't get out of it until somebody else was like, "Hey, have you considered this?" So I think that's awesome.
Yeah, actually, we'll give a specific example. There was this really cool idea I had for my game. It was called the combat stream. And you could basically roll dice and save the values for later for different attack rolls. And it was like a really interesting system. And I really, really loved the idea. And my friend who loves breaking the game, he took one look at that system and said, "It's never going to work." And I'm like, "What are you talking about? Of course it's going to work. It works great." And the more we tested it and the longer we tried to make it work, it just wasn't really working. And I had to eventually kind of just take a hard look at it and be like, no, it's not, that's not it. And actually accept the fact that that mechanic, although very cool, was actually keeping the game from being its best possible version.
Yeah, that makes sense. You've talked about like power gaming, and when I was DMing one D&D campaign, I had one power gamer, and I just hated playing with him because he was like so OP all the time, and I was a new DM, so I didn't even know how D&D really worked. Like, I'd been playing for a year.
Oh no.
But he's like coming, and he's like, okay, so I have like silvery barbs or whatever it is, and he just like kept like almost metagaming.
Mhm.
And like, yeah, I totally get how that's frustrating. To build on that of like working through resistance and incorporating like game mechanics into a story, like how would you do that? Like, how do you incorporate game mechanics into the fiction of the story?
So that's actually a really good question. It's actually one of my favorite questions. The thing is when you're designing mechanics for a game, you have to consider what amount of detail are you going for. Having a strong sense of how detailed you want to get with the mechanic before you do anything else is really important. Not only that, but how does it contribute to the overall experience of the game if you are trying to mix mechanics and narrative? And then also, is the mechanic actually, viable or cool? Or is it just kind of like, it's like it works and it's viable, but it's just kind of like, will people actually use it? So when I go to design mechanics that integrate with narrative functions, I try to keep them very clear, and I like to have very simple guidelines and rules. That way, they were starting from a foundational base that makes sense. Like, obviously, swords do slashing damage. They don't do fire damage unless it's a fire sword, obviously. But actually having these actually just kind of written down and well thought out before you do anything. And then also, when you go to marry those mechanics with the narrative outcomes, that they're satisfying. So when you're talking about like a mechanic, like we'll say in like D&D, like when you roll a nat 20 and get a critical hit, not only is that exciting, but it also mechanically makes sense because you roll that 20, you hit a weak spot that your character just barely got to. Everybody cheers at the table. It feels good. It's rewarding. It's balanced. It's fair. So that's an example of a really good mechanic. An example of a bad mechanic is you hit somebody and you have an automatic counterattack that the other person can't respond to at all, and it does all the damage they did, and it does it right back to the person plus whatever damage you do. That's not really satisfying. It doesn't make any sense. And overall, it makes the player who's maybe on the receiving end of that feel kind of bad because there's nothing they can do about it. So they don't feel like interacting or interfacing with the game anymore. So when you're going to integrate mechanics with narrative, it really actually just has to pass the idiot check or the common sense check. And also when you're building off of these simple ideas, you got to kind of remember that it should be satisfying, balanced, and fun, but it should also just kind of make sense too. And that's how I try and strive to build the mechanics I do for all the games I work on.
I like how you mentioned in the example with the like automatic responding attack that the reason why it doesn't feel fun is because the character doesn't, or the player doesn't get to respond. And you've mentioned before that people don't want infinite freedom, they want choices. And when you restrict those choices in your game mechanics, it can lead to frustration on the part of the player. So I think that makes total sense of when you're looking at looping things into the narrative, you want to provide narrative options rather than, hemming people into a corner.
Yeah, and actually to that point, games invite active participation. That's the whole point of a game, is that I'm actively interfacing with the game and the story or whatever systems are there. If I wanted to just have things happen, I would read a book. I would just passively read the book, lead the experiences of the characters in the book, enjoy the world and kind of ponder the different possibilities. But I'm a passive participant when I'm reading a book. Versus a game, you got to get your fingers in there. You got to roll some dice. You got to throw some literal and fictional elbows sometimes. And I think that's what's appealing about games, is that you're an active member of the story, of the narrative. It's one of the things I enjoy the most about storytelling, especially collaborative storytelling. It's one of the things I really enjoy about TTRPGs.
Okay, perfect. So lightning round, what is your networking process?
My networking process is extremely haphazard because I just started it. I literally find cool people that I think we would work well together, and I just send them a message and see what happens. I try to be as kind as possible and also leave it open-ended. I don't say, like, you have to call me or anything. I just say, if you want to, it's open. If not, have a great day. That's
very cool. Next question, what does community building look like for you?
So community building is basically creating a safe space or environment for people of all different types and diversities to come together with their skills, their talents, and their creativity and work on a community vision or project that allows them to be a part of something greater than themselves. Because I really do think that there's so many creative and talented people out there, and we're only going to get better if we actually come together and work on stuff. I've just met a bunch of creative, wonderful people right here, and I will continue to meet more people, and I would like to grow my community and be a part of others.
That's awesome. Then to that end, where can our listeners find you?
Well, you can find us at salt-system on Instagram, and we also have a website, which is saltsystem.com. And if you are interested in our open beta, we have a few links on there, and we'll be starting probably in August, so definitely try to hop onto that.
Awesome. Well, Christian, this has been a delight. Thank you so much for coming on. Listeners, this has been Quid Pros Quo. We'll see you next week.
Quid Pros Quo is hosted by DC Winters and CK Jensen. If you like this episode, be sure to leave us a rating. And if you'd like to contact us, you can email us at quidprosquo@gmail.com. For more episodes, check us out on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever else you get your podcasts.